Hello everybody and welcome back to the LI webinar series. We're here today with Jon Barton, who's the Director of PBA Solutions, and he's going to be talking you through how to manage Japanese knotweed. So I'm just going to wait, as I do every week, a couple of seconds so that anybody who hasn't logged in yet just tune in with us. I hope everybody's getting ready for Christmas. I'm sure you haven't got too many days left in the office. I hope you haven't. I hope you're all looking forward to a lovely time off, maybe spent with friends or family. This will be the last webinar for this year, and then we start back in mid-January and we'll be promoting that soon. So you'll probably come back into the office after the Christmas break with an email in your inbox there telling you all about our new series. So just to remind you all as well, this is being recorded. So don't panic if you know that friends and colleagues want to tune in. This will be recorded and, as usual, put on the website probably by tomorrow actually. And you'll be able to watch that either on YouTube or through the website. If you know how to download it, you can do that. And you can also embed it on your website if it is a useful tool for you. So without further ado, I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to hand over to Jon. So hello, Jon.
Hello everyone. My name, as said, is Jon Barton. I'm the Director of PBA Solutions. First of all, a little bit about us. We're established in 2007. We're founder members of the PCA Invasive Weed Group. The company is accredited by the PCA and recognised by lenders. We work with a diverse range of clients. So today I'd like to share our experiences and give you some pointers on the identification of Japanese knotweed, the control methods for Japanese knotweed, and I also want to dispel any myths and try and put Japanese knotweed into context. So, Japanese knotweed, why is it a problem? What does it look like? And how to deal with Japanese knotweed? Yes, Japanese knotweed can cause damage. In the slides here we see in the top corner Japanese knotweed crown pushing through and displacing a gravel board to a fence. We see Japanese knotweed pushing up through paving, and we see Japanese knotweed coming up through a crack in concrete and also in a service manhole. But while Japanese knotweed does cause damage, we do need to dispel a myth. Really, Japanese knotweed in the majority of cases does not cause structural damage. Indeed, with structural concrete, if it's well formed, Japanese knotweed is really not going to penetrate it. However, Japanese knotweed will cause problems if there is a weakness in a structure. And moreover, it causes lots of little problems in reality, as we see here. And it's worth considering other plants as well. There's buddleia and ivy, and they also can cause problems. And as we go through this presentation, we'll learn more about Japanese knotweed, what it can do, what it can't do, try and dispel this myth and try and put the whole thing into context. There is a bit of hysteria, a bit of an emotive thing about Japanese knotweed, and we want to put that into perspective. The sort of damage you'll see with Japanese knotweed, we've tried to illustrate here. We've got Japanese knotweed in expansion joints. We've got Japanese knotweed in tarmac. Tarmac and Japanese knotweed just do not go together. If you think about it, tarmac is often an oil-based material. It has to go off to special places to be disposed of, probably as hazardous waste, albeit it could be recycled, but it couldn't be recycled if Japanese knotweed was in the tarmac. So dealing with car parks where there's Japanese knotweed can be costly, can be problematic. We see in the top corner of the slide here a small Japanese knotweed in a gap between a building or a wall and some tarmac. And again, Japanese knotweed almost climbing up a wall where there's a joint between two property walls. It does get into property occasionally, but that's not often, and the bottom picture shows that. I would say that 95% of cases, even where knotweed is within 2 meters of the structure, it will not be a threat to that structure. We've got hundreds of sites on our database, and I would suggest that only 5% could ever be classed as causing structural damage. Equally, it's worth considering, whilst Japanese knotweed does spread, it's a myth to say it's a triffid in that it rapidly spreads. It spreads in years, not days, weeks or months. So I think what we're seeing here, and what I'm trying to get across, is that Japanese knotweed does cause damage, but the issues are often to do with gaps in structures, expansion joints in structures, and more often than not, the garden, the outdoor situation. So to get Japanese knotweed into perspective, we need to look at these common problems, and these are summarized on this slide. Fundamentally, Japanese knotweed is an alien invasive. Clearly it comes from Japan, and in our environment it thrives. And as you see on this list, it will displace native plants. And that is a real problem, especially in our countryside. It easily self-propagates, and we'll look at that later. If you've got Japanese knotweed on land, it will reduce the land value. Large volumes of soil are impacted by Japanese knotweed, and that can result in high costs of removal. Treatment of Japanese knotweed can take time, especially in comparison to our native weeds, and that also has a knock-on cost. Erosion and flooding are a problem, especially on our riverbanks. If you've got Japanese knotweed growing or another invasive weed growing on a riverbank, then by its nature it can cause erosion. So this list on this slide is there to really try and put Japanese knotweed into perspective, the problems that it can cause. So how do we get a handle on the problem? Why is it doing this? The big question is why does it cause all these problems? And the reason is it comes from Japan. It's not from the UK. Our environment is super for it. It loves our environment, and it's not a fussy eater. It thrives in varying soil types. It's as hard as nails. It comes from Mount Fuji. If it can survive up there rather, it can really survive in our environments, and it's a bit hyperactive as well. It does grow quite rapidly, certainly in May and June when it's putting on new growth at the start of the year. The nasty bit of Japanese knotweed is its roots. We call these rhizomes. Rhizomes are below ground stems that grow along the ground and then pop up as they grow along, and new plants are then produced. And that's very much like a strawberry plant, if you've ever looked at how a strawberry plant grows. Again, Japanese knotweed, like many other plants, is adventitious. It goes where the food is. If there's a water course, if there's a service run, if there's some damp areas, maybe along a building, it will go for those areas. It will grow towards those areas. Japanese knotweed, visible Japanese knotweed, will send out roots, and it's these roots that spread and pop up elsewhere. It can be said that knotweed will spread 7 meters from a visible stand, but in most cases this is a bit less. In practice, we find that Japanese knotweed will typically spread 2 meters, maybe 3 meters from a visible stand. And again, the rhizomes are predominantly in the first half meter of ground, and if you were excavating Japanese knotweed out, you'd find that you'd probably be excavating to a depth of 1 meter, maybe 1.5 meters, and on occasions you would be going down deeper to chase out the deeper roots at the heart of a stand of Japanese knotweed. So looking at this slide here, we've got a cross-section of soil profile, and you can see in there the roots, and you can see little orange specks, and that's a typical telltale sign of Japanese knotweed. The orange of Japanese knotweed root is its signature, really, and once you've seen it once you've picked up a piece of rhizome, you've snapped it, it snaps like a carrot, you'll never forget it. So this point in the slide is good at taking that on board to help people in the future when they're needing to identify Japanese knotweed. So how does it spread? It is the roots. And here you can see in this top slide fragments of Japanese knotweed that we got off a site when we were doing some expert witness work. The knotweed can stay dormant, and we wanted here to prove whether knotweed root would regrow if we propagated it in the right conditions, and it actually did here. And that illustrates how invasive it can be. This slide below shows a crown of knotweed. That's the base of the plant above ground. The point with Japanese knotweed is that it really only spreads through vegetative regeneration. That is, it won't spread by seed. Japanese knotweed is a single-sex plant in this country, and therefore the way that it spreads is through vegetative propagation. That happens through fly tipping, the movement of contaminated soil with root fragments in it, and I would suggest that ignorance is probably the biggest driver, or was the biggest driver, to the spread of this invasive plant. So I've gone too far, let's go back again. So the legislation around Japanese knotweed is the Wildlife and Countryside Act. I'm sure that many of you would know this act in part. It says that anyone who plants or otherwise causes Japanese knotweed to grow in the wild shall be guilty of an offence. That's all very well. It's a little bit woolly because we don't know what's in the wild. It really has no help to the urban environment, and there's very little case evidence to say that people have used this piece of legislation in litigation. In terms of waste from a construction site or waste, Japanese knotweed waste, the Environmental Protection Act says that soil containing Japanese knotweed rhizome must be moved to a licensed landfill site that is recognised to take such waste. Over the last couple of years, the police and the local authorities have been able to put enforcement notices on people who don't deal with their Japanese knotweed if the problem is impacting upon the local community, the social side of community. If someone's not doing something they should do in respect to Japanese knotweed, then the police and local authorities can intervene. And I would imagine that this sort of thing could grow in the future, that more and more people will use this method of making things happen to get neighbours to deal with Japanese knotweed. One point on the Environmental Protection Act: Japanese knotweed is an active waste, it's not a hazardous waste, but it still needs to be taken to an appropriate licensed landfill site, and as with all wastes and landfill sites, they're becoming more scarce as time goes on. There is a limitation to how much landfill that we can do, so we're finding that we're having to take Japanese knotweed waste further and further to get it dealt with, and clearly that can be quite expensive. So there has been some recent changes from the government in their stance on Japanese knotweed. They've removed the EA Code of Practice, and it's now been superseded, we understand it, with the Regulatory Position Statement 178. It's a statement rather than guidance, and for landscape architects I would say make sure you've got a copy of the EA Code of Practice. There are copies on our website. It's a good document to get an understanding on the problem. There is clear guidance there that is good and will stand the test of time at present, I believe. The position statement is just that. It's a statement. It's stating what you should do, what you shouldn't do. One thing it is doing that's perhaps different is it puts more emphasis on the need to have a management plan in place, whatever you're doing, and that's something that we would really endorse. And we'll look at management plans later and the importance of a management plan being quite a clear, concise document that really does address the problem for the Pacific site. So we've looked at the problem, we looked at the legislation around Japanese knotweed. We now need to look at how we can identify Japanese knotweed. There are 6 key identifiers, and on this slide they're listed. There's the rhizome, that's the root, we've looked at that already. There's the crown, we've looked at that already, that's the plant mass at the bottom of the plant on the ground. There are the stems, which are bamboo-like, the petiole, the leaf shape, and its flower. We'll look at those in a bit more detail. So the stems are very much bamboo-like. They're hollow inside. On the outside, they're green with a sort of a flecky red pattern. The early plants look a little bit like asparagus. Not that I've tasted it, but maybe one day I will, I don't know. The plants rapidly grow from the small plant you see there in the top corner into a 2-meter high plant, very much like bamboo, with these hollow canes. The leaves develop to start with, they're a little bit shriveled. They soon turn into a spade type leaf, as this middle slide shows with its flower. Again, the rhizome, the roots, they snap like a carrot. They're orange in the middle. Once you've seen it, you probably won't forget it. And in the bottom corner here we have the crown of Japanese knotweed. This is a very mature crown. That's probably 10 years old, I would say. It's a mass of woody material that's built up over the years. It's years and years of compounded growing that's turned into this sort of woody above ground structure that you see here. So Philopia japonica, which is the common Japanese knotweed that's in the media that we usually talk about, looks like this in terms of its leaf shape, flower. It's a spade-shaped leaf, like the playing card, and what's very much evident is this straight back to the leaf. That's very much Japanese knotweed. In this slide here, you'll see the zigzaggy shape of the stem, and it can be a bit more defined than this, but it is very evident when you start looking at the plant. The top stems of a plant have a reddish tinge to them. Again, this is the inflorescence of flower that you see late on in the summer. There are other types and species of Japanese knotweed, and just to confuse you, here are some more slides. So in the top left-hand corner we have the typical Japanese knotweed, Philopia japonica. You can gauge the size of the plant by the hand in the photograph, and then moving on through we have giant knotweed, much bigger leaf, and the back of the leaf isn't so spade-like, it's not so flat. Again, we have the bohemica, which is a cross between the two of the it's a cross between Philopia japonica and the giant knotweed. This plant is the worrying one. It can reproduce by seed, and it is a lot harder to control. The others, the Pescaria, I don't think are quite so hard to control, and they're not that popular or evident. We don't see that coming about that much. We do see dwarf knotweed occasionally. Again, that is what it is. It's a smaller version of Fallopian japonica. It is easier to control, and the edge of the leaf is sort of a little bit sort of serrated or frilly, I suppose you would say. But as I've said, Bohemica, the hybrid knotweed, is the one to watch out for. It's very much like Japanese knotweed, Fallopian japonica. There is a bit of variance in its appearance, but essentially it is a larger leafed version of Fallopian japonica, and if you see that, then it is going to be harder to deal with than the conventional Japanese knotweed. So now we know what it looks like, we know the problem, we know the legislation in brief. We need to know what the control choices are. The nuts and bolts of it are that the faster you want to get rid of Japanese knotweed, the higher the cost. So at the top of the tree we have excavation. Excavating and removal of Japanese knotweed off-site would be the most expensive, but I would say that if you want eradication, if you want true eradication, which is to completely remove the plant, then removal off-site is the answer. That's what needs to happen, and you'll find that in most cases on development sites that turns out to be the only answer, or at least the control of excavating the knotweed is the only answer, because it's in the way of the new development. At the other end of the scale is herbicide treatment, which is by far the cheaper option. You're treating the knotweed. The rhizome will stay in the ground. It will either decay or it will go in some sort of dormancy, which is why excavation is often considered preferable on development sites. In between these two extremes, we can look at on-site controls. So that's burying Japanese knotweed, excavating Japanese knotweed and burying it in the ground. The position statement that we looked at earlier makes it very clear that it's got to be buried to a certain depth. The other option would be to bund Japanese knotweed and control it above ground. That's really relocating Japanese knotweed from one location, which is an area that you perhaps want to develop, and put it somewhere else, an area that you wouldn't want to develop. The area would have to stay within the land area, the ownership land area, and there will be some other factors to consider as well. But primarily you would be relocating the Japanese knotweed to another area carefully and then treating it over a period of time. There are other methods that you can consider, such as sifting the soil. That's removing the roots out of the soil mechanically. From our experience, we find that a bit of I guess a needle in a haystack exercise. It's very hard to know that you've really got all the Japanese knotweed out of the soil. It, I think, has its place in terms of reducing the invasive nature of impacted soil, and that can help if you're burying soil on site. There is a line of thought that you could bury sifted soil at a shallower depth than that you would ordinarily bury contaminated, impacted soil, although that has to work with the position statement, which makes depths of burial of contaminated material very clear. Root barrier is another tool that you can use to deal with Japanese knotweed. It's quite common that Japanese knotweed will be found in several properties, but then you, as a landscape architect, us as an invasive weed specialist, would only be working for one client on one property. So we might well be excavating in one property, putting in the root barrier and treating in another. The root barrier acts as a physical block, and it's an added measure to the treatment process to make sure that Japanese knotweed then doesn't reinfest the excavated area. So in a nutshell, the faster you want to get rid of Japanese knotweed, the higher the cost. To work out what kind of treatment program you need, it's important to put together a management plan, to look at the risk, to look at what's happening on site, where the Japanese knotweed is in relation to boundaries, structures, services, watercourses, because all of these things will influence what you can and can't do. So for example, if you have a retained tree on site and there's Japanese knotweed within the root protection area of that tree that then spreads further out into the site, you would probably be able to dig out the Japanese knotweed within the site area, but within the tree exclusion zone you wouldn't be able to excavate because the tree is to be retained and you would damage the tree, and that would have ramifications. So you would have to dig out the site side, put a root barrier in, and then treat with herbicide under the tree. And these issues have to be looked at survey stage and put together into a management plan so the right control program can be put together that's relevant to the site. Another factor that really has to be considered is plant physiology. It's so important to understand what the actual plant that you're looking at, that you're looking to manage, treat, control, remove, what is it actually doing? Is it a young plant? Is it a mature plant? Has it been treated before? Has someone tried to get rid of it? Is it a dense stand of Japanese knotweed that's had no treatment, or is it peppered growths of Japanese knotweed, small shoots all over the place that are a result of some previous disturbance? All of these things need to be understood, because if they aren't, then the control program that comes out of the management plan won't be robust. And this is what it's all about, is having robust control measures to deal with Japanese knotweed. And finally on the slide, you need to consider future land use. So as we said before, if you're developing a property or developing land, put new property on there, new dwelling on there, then you're probably going to have to excavate your Japanese knotweed. But if it is an existing property and you need to deal with your Japanese knotweed, maybe for a mortgage application or a request from a mortgage lender, then it could be more appropriate to herbicide treat the Japanese knotweed, because it's simpler and more practical to do so than excavate, which in a built environment, an urban environment, can be logistically and practically quite complicated to implement. So to get a handle on how Japanese knotweed is seen in the property market, it's worth to consider what the property market is doing. Mortgage lenders are reluctant to lend on property where there is knotweed, or where knotweed has been identified. The lenders are adverse to lending on property and that has Japanese knotweed, and they will want to see a Japanese knotweed management plan in place that is implemented and is guaranteed. The surveyor, an RICS surveyor, has a duty to identify Japanese knotweed, and the vendor has an obligation through the TA6 form to declare the presence of Japanese knotweed. And then there's the specialist. The specialist, such as PBA, has to bring all these things together, and this is what we do day in, day out. We make sure that a property that's impacted with Japanese knotweed is surveyed, a management plan put in place, a treatment plan agreed to that meets the needs of the lender and the needs of the buyer, so a property sale can move ahead. It's worth pointing out that there are increasing legal disputes in regard to Japanese knotweed, and the diminution of property, the reduction in its value, is significant, even if structural damage is rare. The issue of Japanese knotweed is an emotive one, and as a result we are where we are with it, and it's important that the processes are followed and understood by all parties. So the current situation is that we have this problem in the property market especially, and we've had the problem of Japanese knotweed for a number of years. So the way industry has addressed this is to have the trade body, the Property Care Association, set up at perhaps the request of the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, who can make sure that the specialist companies are capable and able to deal with Japanese knotweed, that they have staff that are trained to survey for Japanese knotweed, that they have technicians capable of doing the control and treatment work. An accredited company will be able to offer a guarantee, an insurance-backed guarantee on their work. They will also be able to offer a way of escrow funding. That's a bank account where funds can be deposited for future treatment of Japanese knotweed that is protected for future parties, such as a buyer of a property, so they know that the money is going to be used to treat the Japanese knotweed. On development sites, developers need to protect their land as an asset. They need to avoid the Japanese knotweed spreading to other properties. They need to avoid litigation from neighbours. And so how can they do this? They can do this through early identification, the mapping of Japanese knotweed, putting together a robust control strategy, as we've spoken about, the use of accredited specialists. The result then is perhaps long-term cost savings and a reduced cost of management because the right pathway has been followed. That avoids litigation, and it means that asset values are protected, and if new property is being built, that property is then saleable. A robust Japanese knotweed control program is effective if you use a PCA specialist company that understands these hurdles that need to be jumped through to deal with Japanese knotweed. Fundamentally, early identification of Japanese knotweed really is important. If it's identified early in the design phase of a development, then there's probably going to be more control options available to you, and the cost of control could be cheaper. In identifying Japanese knotweed early, it's easier to contain the problem, the prevention of unintentional intentional spread. Builders have a habit of running all over a building site and thinking they can do anything anywhere if allowed. That needs to be contained. You can't have people working in areas impacted by Japanese knotweed, and those areas have to be fenced off and looked after, and that is very important on development sites. So thank you for listening. We'll have some questions in a minute. I have got some other slides, a few examples of different things that we've been involved with. There's a project here that's been overrun by Japanese knotweed. That's not untypical. Treatment, if implemented, can get rid of Japanese knotweed. Again, Japanese knotweed, very mature there. This has been left unadulterated. You can tell that because there's lots of other vegetation growing around it. It means that when we survey a site, we know exactly what we've got in front of us. If we see sites where someone's been tampering with the Japanese knotweed, we have to really assume the worst. And that's a job that we were working on, where we were excavating the Japanese knotweed out and taking that off site to landfill. Excavation in progress. You can see there that the Japanese knotweed stand, that was the one you saw earlier, has been excavated probably to about 1.5 meters depth, and then in the middle of the stand we've gone down much deeper because we found some very deep roots. Completed excavation, all fenced off and safe for the builder to build or demolish his building. Typically when we're looking at producing a management plan, the fundamentals of it are is a drawing to show where the Japanese knotweed is, which is in the red, then the extended area, which is the impacted area, and then we look at the potential impacted area, which is 7 meters out from the Japanese knotweed. And on a construction site, development site, it is good practice to put signage up to tell people that work is in progress. They know what's going on. Digging out Japanese knotweed and then putting in and then burying it is often effective on site. It's environmentally friendly. It is more logistically challenging. You'll see here that you've got 2 excavators. If you're taking waste off site, you'd only have 1. And here we see different forms of treatment: injection, foliar application, and the cutting back of Japanese knotweed in the winter. Thank you for listening.
Hi, John. Thank you very much for that. I really didn't kind of grasp how, yeah, just how intensive it was, and wow, I've certainly learned a lot. So thank you very much. That was a very comprehensive webinar, so you probably covered everything. But if anybody wants to kind of delve into a certain bit of it more, or a certain project you want to know more about, or have any questions on this subject, now would be a great time to write in and ask us any. But if you're anything like me and you can't think at the top of your head, then you know, this is not now or never. You have got the opportunity to email us in, either myself, anyone on the team here at the Landscape Institute, or John. You can see email address and websites at the top of that slide there. So you know, do keep this communication going. Do keep the questions coming in. Standardly, after every one of these webinars, you'll be sent an email asking for your feedback and any questions you would like to ask. So I'm just going to open this up now, and we've got a question from Nick. So, there we go. Question from Nick, John. What would be a typical herbicide program for this species? Sorry, I talked over you there. What would be a typical herbicide program for this species? So types of herbicide and numbers of applications, etc.
Okay, so a typical program would probably last 3 to 4 years of actual treatment using a chemical. The main chemical that is now available is glyphosate. Some of the more powerful chemicals have been removed from the market, but one should always take their own advice on that. The best time to treat Japanese knotweed is in the autumn. At that time, the Japanese knotweed is going into senescence, and that's seen in this image that we've still got on the screen actually. In fact, it's probably a little bit late for treating here, but the idea is that when a plant's going into senescence, it's drawing through photosynthesis energy into the roots, and if you're able to treat the Japanese knotweed at that time, then the idea is the chemical will be drawn deeper into the roots and be more effective. And it is definitely the case. If we can get a chemical treatment into a stand of Japanese knotweed, probably September, October, the effect of that treatment is really good, and the duration of treatment can be reduced as a result of that. We generally look to treat 2 or 3 times a year, but most importantly to try and get that late summer treatment in. Once you've done 2 or 3 years, once you've done 1 or 2 years of treatment, you'll find that the regrowth is less and less, and then it becomes a question of making sure that there is enough plant matter there, enough leaf surface area there to treat the Japanese knotweed. And in that case, there is certainly a case for not doing too many treatments, allowing the Japanese knotweed to grow and doing a single treatment at the best time of year, at the end of the summer. Stem injection is also another option that can be considered. It works well on the more established plants, but later on, when the plants have stopped growing so vigorously because of the treatments you've been doing, you'll get lots of weak, small shoots that really will be too small for effective stem injection, so you'll be back to the foliar injection. I hope that helps.
Hi, thanks for that, John. I hope that answers your question, Nick. I was also wondering if there was a kind of, was it always injection first, then sprays, then cutting, or did it was it different per species? And you sort of answered, you get in it when it's established. When they're too small, obviously, then you can spray and cut. Is it always kind of that system, or do you really have to play it by ear with the different species?
No, the same approach would be there for the different types of Japanese knotweed. We favour foliar injection over stem injection, to be honest, and there has been some research in Wales on 2 different approaches to chemical treatment, and through our experience we've always found a glyphosate-based foliar treatment to be the best solution. We would go against this, we would change that if you were near a watercourse. There's an advantage of stem injection because you're less likely to have, well, you won't have drift of chemical into the watercourse. If you have Japanese knotweed growing in vegetation you want to keep, someone's prized shrub border, herbaceous border, then stem injection is an alternative. On some occasions we will paint a solution of chemical onto the leaves of the plant for that reason, to stop there being any drift or potential to damage other plants that you want to retain.
All right. Yes, thanks. That's really helpful. I think that's probably covered absolutely everything. That it's really comprehensive study of them there. So thank you very much. And if nobody else has got any questions at this time, then I think we're all done for the day. So I'd just like to once again say thank you to everybody for joining. Thank you very much, John, for doing this webinar for us today.
That's okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you. And for everyone, just wish you a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and we will come back and see you next year. So thank you and goodbye.